Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Garrison, and this is the second session of the second day of the 2022 Brass Spring Symposium. I want to acknowledge my fellow committee members again on the Business Reference and Academic Libraries Subcommittee responsible for planning this event: Charissa Jefferson, Christy Cunningham, Jennifer Rundles, and Angel Truesdale. If you want to revisit and re-engage with the presentations from today, the video and presentation materials will be made available to all registered participants. During the next session, there will be several opportunities to interact through Jamboards and our speaker, and we encourage you to enter questions you may have into chat. We should have several minutes to address them toward the end of the presentation. So our next speaker is Terence O'Neill with his presentation, Back to Business Librarianship, Using Logic, Modeling, and Other Frameworks to Navigate Career Junctures. Terence, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much, Brian. Thanks everyone for organizing this and for bringing all these great speakers together, and for you as an audience for coming today and sharing this with me. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. If at any point things don't look like they should, let me know. So as Brian said, my topic is Back to Business Librarianship, Using Logic, Modeling, and Other Frameworks to Navigate Career Junctures. My name is Terence O'Neill. This is my email here, and if you are at all curious or want to chat with me further about these topics or anything else, please feel free to reach out. So this is a little bit of a different talk for me and probably for you, and a bit of a departure from the other talks as well. I'm going to include some personal narrative as well as some interactive web exercises. The web things that are interactive I've put on purple slides. So that's just a cue that, oh, this is a chance to follow the chat link and go and do something and be a little bit more responsive to the content. And we're going to emphasize logic models, but I'm going to mention a few other sources as well, and then have space for discussion at the end. I'm doing it this way because I think sharing my process may be helpful for you or some of you some point in the future. And I wanted to encourage people to consider their own frames and how they approach their own career changes and what they're trying to do, and even how they plan out their years. And I think there's a real value in creating dialogue for career decisions, and that professional organizations especially can provide this space for people to talk with a little bit more transparency perhaps than they would in their other professional lives about what they're going through, how they're processing the different opportunities, and just thinking through these things. So hopefully this will be a positive example of that, but that there will be other opportunities in Brass going forward for that. So the first sort of opportunity to collaborate is I have created an open collection on Zotero, and it includes the core items from this talk. So if you see anything that you want to follow up on, you can follow this link and grab that content there. There are some books I mentioned, there's some different articles I mentioned. But I'd also like to open this up such that if you're a user of Zotero and the online interface, and you have content that you think is useful for processing career junctures, for thinking through things, feel free to drop that stuff in the chat as well, but that this open Zotero collection contribute there if you think of anything that's particularly valuable. So, as the name of the talk kind of indicates, I'm coming back to business librarianship, and I thought it might be helpful to kind of break things out in a bit of a timeline. So in 2013, I got the job of entrepreneurship librarian at my current institution. And I was really excited. The role brought together, working with maker spaces and economic development, different things that I'd been really excited about in the past and worked on in the past. Both at graduate school and previously in the Peace Corps, and just I thought all of it is melting down into one particular form of that job. And 4-5 years later, I was promoted, at the same institution, to the head of a new unit. This was very exciting. It was high profile for the library, this unit that was being formed. And it was something that I'd identified before this opportunity had come up as, oh, that would be a good career goal for me. That this would be great to lead a team doing things I'm excited about. Fast forward 3.5 years, and about a year ago, I was in the Educause managers, I forget what it's called, managers workshop. And this was a fantastic opportunity to learn from CIOs. There were probably 4 CIOs from R1 institutions mentoring me and this cohort through this process. And I got really excited about having a goal formation process on my team that everybody could be bought into. And so I worked really hard. I got lots of feedback from peers in my institution, from former managers, from CIOs, say like, okay, let's really work on creating this process. And it failed. It didn't go well. So going into April, May and summer of 2021, it just had sort of ground down and it wasn't very effective. And I felt like it was almost an excuse for my team to become more splintered. And so I was deeply frustrated by that. At the same time, we were about a year and change into COVID. I've got 2 little kids. My wife also works full time. And I was struggling with sleep. I was seeing a sleep counselor. I was talking to counselors at work through our employee assistance program, and just generally feeling very tight in my job, like little flexibility. So that's the position I was in about a year ago. And then a few things happened. And I think this is a very COVID sort of story in that, I was spending a lot of time in my house, a lot of time doing kids, work, and chores, right? Like that was my whole life. And I wasn't going to see family. And then a crisis happened in my family. There was a health problem with one of my parents. And this precipitated me going to Pennsylvania. I hadn't seen my parents very much, and spending a lot of time with them for a chunk of time. And I think that this encouraged me to really take a step back. Another thing at this same time is, for the first time since I joined my current institution, I had applied for other work. So I really considered, what would it look like to be at another institution? And all 3 of these were steps I think that helped to take a step back and to gain some perspective on my career. So this is the first opportunity, well, in addition to the Zotero, but I'd like you to think a little bit, and these can be ways big and small, but how do you all take a step back? What are the things that you do to get some perspective on your life? So we'll give a couple minutes for people to post and just share with each other. And I feel lucky that so many other of the earlier presenters introduced Jamboards. Now we're all seasoned pros here. So I don't know what happened there, that it's cleared a couple times. But I wanted to highlight a couple that I saw that I thought were particularly useful. A lot of these are like small things that people build into their regular routines, right? Nature, unplugging, exercise, meditation. And I think that those are fantastic practices. But there's also some of these big things that we weren't as able to do during the time of COVID, like travel, like go on a vacation. Maybe even talking to specific family and friends was more difficult or strained during this time. So I want to thank everybody for engaging with this, and I'll come back to my slides here. And this was just a light way to kind of begin thinking about using these interactive tools. So for me, I was in that period of tightness, constraint, and then I did those three big things to get perspective. And then there were three specific influences that I kind of kept coming back to that I'd like to share with you all. So the first one is by a book by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a social organizer in Detroit. And Brown talks about sort of the patterns that are surfacing throughout our lives and how are you noticing those patterns. And their work, I think, is very inspiring when you think about community change and how we can each embody in different roles the change that we want to see. And they have wonderful questions to help you kind of tease apart your own values and think about how they manifest in your work, such as this one. What are you embodying in your daily life in that work? So I was seeking to do that. What is actually important to me, and how am I seeing it? And I noticed somebody put down, oh, I look through my notebook, my journaling, my calendar to see the patterns and surface the patterns that are important. And the second thing is that I noticed in those patterns is that even though I'd gotten away from entrepreneurship, I was still listening to podcasts and reading books very regularly focused on transformative entrepreneurship, focused on technology change and how it's changing society. And I'm still deeply inspired by that. So I was seeing that sort of come up. And in particular, the work of Azim Azar, I found to be consistently inspiring and feeling like, oh, I need to be connected to that in some fashion. And around this time, it actually became an opportunity to come back to the role that the person who had succeeded me as entrepreneurship librarian had gone on to another institution. So that role was opened back up. And I was thinking about what are the patterns that are important to me, how am I inspired by the changing technology? And so I said, oh, that's an opportunity for me to go back to that role, perhaps. And I was sort of applying this test from this group associated with effective altruism, the 80,000 hours kind of question. You have 80,000 hours potentially in your work life. Well, what do you want to do with it? What do you want to do with it? How do you want it to feel as well? So I was applying that test to this opportunity to come back to entrepreneurship librarian role. And it passed, or I felt good about it. And I kind of settled on this goal of wanting to coach entrepreneurs in information search, use, and organization so that they can better launch businesses. And thinking about both undergrads, but also technology transfer, and also the people in the community that I can kind of work with, people in the entrepreneurship ecosystem that, support professionals. So to potentially have this big impact that I cared about and I felt empowered to work in. But that was just for me. I'd like for you all, and we'll kind of work towards this again in the next few slides, to reflect a bit here on what is your impact that you want to work towards. What kinds of things do you aspire to change behavior around, or that you really want to be involved in? So let's give that a couple minutes as well. And I left this anonymous because I received some feedback like, oh, I don't know if people really want to like publicly claim this or this sort of thing. But it's all anonymous, so feel free to experiment a little bit. Feel free to play with this question a little bit. Yeah, I think there's a lot of inspiration that resonates, and just even looking at what other people are claiming, and that they're looking to make, changes around in other is really inspiring to me. And you
Terence,
see things here. Yeah.
sorry, maybe a good percentage of our participants can't enter the Jamboard. They're wondering if you could possibly share it on your screen. It looks like there's an upper limit of maybe
yeah.
30 people or something that can enter at one time.
Oh, sorry for that. I knew I should have like burnt an offering to the Zoom deities before this, that everything would work well. How does that look, Brian?
Looks good. I think everybody can see now.
But just to highlight a few, centering equity, inclusivity, anti-racism, accessibility, and social justice in librarianship, I think is a fantastic inspiration. It's something to aim for, and it's the kind of thing that's a big, challenging, and something that could, it takes thought to think about, well, how do you do that big thing? Same with something like get students to think out of the box with research skills. And for a couple of these, you see something where you're looking for students or for researchers to have persistent behavior change, right? To actually be able to carry through these skills that they're developing through their subsequent, classes, the work that they're doing later on in life. And I think that those are the kinds of things where you're saying, I want to have that persistent goal, that are very appropriate for this process and for thinking about and planning for. So that's the next part. Can you all see my slides now?
I believe so.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brian. Brian, you're proxy for the whole group. I appreciate it. So as I was coming back into that role and thinking about my big goal, I'd come across some work on the topic of logic modeling. And I found it to be a very powerful tool for thinking about how to go from something big and impactful, a goal that we're interested in doing, and how to make that actionable, right? How to operationalize that. This comes out of the nonprofit world. The Kellogg Foundation is has been deeply involved in this in the past. And it's basically a way to coach nonprofits and other groups that might have big goals, but that are hard to measure or hard to, really make visible in a very clear way. So how can you kind of think about how are your activities working towards that impact that you want to have, and how are you making that work visible? I'm deeply indebted to an article by Maris Longmire and Sarah Murphy out of Ohio State University, Framing Outcomes in Programming Assessment for Digital Scholarship Services, a Logic Model Approach. So that's in the Zotero. If you're really interested in this, I encourage you to dig more deeply there. But these are the 5 steps of the logic model, where you're starting with that impact, but you're thinking about what are the behavior changes, your outcomes that are going to lead to that impact. The outputs are where that's made visible. So, it might be the classes that you've worked with, your number of consultations, your big wins, whatever that work that looks, oh, here's where it's visible, but it's leading to this behavior change that you want, right? You may have a workshop or something like that, and that's an output, but the outcome is the behavior change you want. And your activities are what you spend time on to create the output. And it's a little bit fuzzy to think through all this. So I'm going to give some examples here. And your resources are what you have to spend, what kind of resources you have to direct in this process. And I like to focus, and I've seen this in other places as well, focus on the middle 3, because it helps kind of clear it up and make it a little less complicated. Say, what are your activities that you can control? What are you working on? How are you directing your time and energy towards outputs, those things that are visible, but how are the outputs connected then to the outcomes that you want? And I think a lot of times people can focus on the counting stats or say the stats don't matter. But I think that in this context, what we're saying is that the outcomes are what matters, but how are you making that work visible for yourself and for others? So to give an example of how this might work and how it works for me, I create a logic model for my work as entrepreneurship librarian. And this is very helpful for me at this stage in the process where I'm coming back to this role and sort of have experience in the role. I have a network in the role. I know how it works on this campus a little bit. But I don't have many fixed obligations. So how can I plan out my time to have the impact I want to have? So if I sort of say, okay, the big impact is, more effective entrepreneurship by students and tech transfer professionals. Well, what is the behavior change that embodies that impact? Maybe it's, better searching, knowledge management, and decision-making by those parties. But I can't see that necessarily, right? I can't, be a fly on the wall at the tech transfer office or know exactly how it's leading to better entrepreneurship. But what I can see is, the outputs that I can work on, and I can try and manifest these things. So highly specialized coaching interactions with specific users at specific points in the entrepreneurship process. And I'm even more detailed as I look at my own sort of year and planning things out. But the activities then are how I spend my time to get to these outputs, because even these outputs are dependent upon other people and the opportunities reaching me. So I need to engage in outreach. I need to focus on developing great materials. I want to practice writing these things out. So I'm getting my ideas, working on them, working on my communication skills, getting feedback, and then engaging in targeted professional development to become more and more of an expert in these areas that are important to these processes. And then the resources are time, my network, my expertise. So Now I'd like to go to another Jamboard. I apologize for the not knowing the limitations of the Jamboards. Can you all see the Jamboard on my screen, Brian?
I believe we can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I'll try and go zoom in a little bit here. But what I'd like you to do right now, and some of you might choose to do this on paper, is to work with the ideas, the big concepts of activities, outputs, and outcomes. If you start with the outcomes, the behavior changes that you want for that impact that you envision, what would that look like? How would behaviors change? And then try and reverse engineer it with how would that be visible? How would you make that count? You know, would it be workshops, books, consultations? And then you further unpack that to say, what are my activities that would lead to that? So I put one example up of sort of how these things might connect. And this is a big concept, so no big pressure here. But any kinds of examples might be helpful for the group as well. So we'll give this a few minutes here. And we'll give this a little bit more time, but I'd be very interested if anybody's willing to volunteer what, how their activities might lead to their outputs that would work towards those outcomes. So think about if you'd like to share that. But I'll give it a couple more minutes for work. Great. I encourage everyone to continue working on this. I find when I get really deep into logic modeling, I go into what my family calls my beautiful mind phase, where I just get like the largest sheet of paper I can find and make all these blocks and have all these lines. And I've talked to people working in educational assessment, and I've seen like the actual formal representation of what it looks like to have 60 people working on teams that are working across all of this, and that looks almost as messy. So it's very natural for this to be kind of like a process where there's lots of moving parts, of course. But if it's can help you at all, work on your thinking of how your activities lead to your outputs, that visible, those stats, those big wins, and that how those represent the outcomes you and your library want to have, then I think it's a win, even if it's a messy process. Does anybody want to share any of their work or what they've been posting or drawing for their logic models?
Maybe someone could raise a hand to indicate if they'd like to share.
And I'm seeing some really good examples here. I think that if I might speak for somebody else, this the data management plans is a good example here, where the outcome is, they want people to have more confidence. And how that might look like and what they might represent in their work and telling the story of their work is the edited and revised versions of a data management plan for a specific application. So they know that work is happening, that impact is being worked towards by seeing those iterations. And then under their activities, their consultation is going to be focused on the different sections of the data management plan and what they're looking for. And I'm speaking and imagining for this person here, I think that that's sort of getting towards what I think is a natural outcome of this process, is really thinking about what are the specific skills and things you want to coach people on through your work. What are the really specific ways you're going to speak to people, you're going to work with people to help them improve their process? Brian, any hands?
I'm not seeing any at the moment.
Okay, great.
Oh,
great.
Lene, it looks like Lene is interested in, has raised her hand.
Please. I had the data management plan one, and I was wondering about the next part, which is impact. So could an impact be like utilization of business resources in grant applications, in grant research? Could that be an impact because of their ability to write data management plans?
I think you might say that's another
is that another outcome?
Yeah, I think that'd be another outcome. But the impact, a lot of times the impact might be things that you could pull from like a strategic plan or something along those lines, where you're trying to have this big, let's say the research, like you're trying to increase the research money won by a unit, right? Or make your folks research grants more competitive, right? I think of outputs as anything that's making your work more visible, and how like you're getting counting stats. And maybe you could say that's an outcome too, unless you could sort of say, oh, the output is being made visible there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like more business researchers are successfully achieving grants or something as an impact based on those sort of outcomes if they're feeling more confident.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
Right. And it might be another one for that impact might be, the libraries being integrated into the research life cycle of the university. Right.
That would be an amazing impact.
Right. And that's kind of what you're talking about. And you might have that strategic goal for your library. Say, oh, we want to be integrated. But then you can sort of unpack that and say, well, what does that look like? And it might be like, well, they see the value and they know how to use the library. Those might be some outcomes. And the outputs might be, these focused training sessions, our statistics, our so our statistics for focused training sessions, as well as we know they're using the DMP tool or what have you. And your activities might be, well, how are we going to drive those outputs? How are we going to move the needle on those metrics, right? What are the things that you spend your time on that will lead to DMP tool use? For me, it's like, oh, it's outreach. That's where you have to say, I'm going to spend some time forming the relationships and emailing people just to get to the consultation numbers that would lead further down the line. Or I need to make sure I'm making my materials excellent so that when I get those opportunities, we have excellent interactions that lead to those outcomes that I want. Does anybody have anything else they'd like to share? And Lenny, feel free to follow up with that as well. Carmen?
I think I'm trying to figure out just where different boxes things belong.
Yeah.
So I didn't hear an outcome that has to do with what the students should be able to do in their senior year as an undergraduate. Having transferable knowledge so that they know what resources to use besides just Google. And I think where I'm getting confused is whether something is an activity or something is an output. And so I put in here as an activity, database usage statistics increase, citations in research projects show a variety of resources. But is that really more of an outcome than an output?
I think you could, I always think about outputs as where the work is made sort of visible. So you might say like, yes, that's an output, or that's an indicator of that outcome. But you could also say the workshops themselves and your stats there, are part of your outputs as well. The number of students reached, the number of classes you have.
So it's really what I'm doing as an output that then is an outcome that I can assess.
Yes, right.
Okay.
So outputs are really focused on where you can, like, how are you assessing those? Outputs are focused on how are you assessing those outcomes? How's it made visible? And I know it's like tricky with activities, because sometimes for me that's recruiting the teaching and sometimes it's doing the teaching, right? And then the output is, well, I taught. But that's the statistics for the teaching perhaps.
Oh, okay. I think this is more clear. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks, Carmen. And if you go on YouTube and you go on, or you look at, Maris's work, there's lots of people that are more eloquent and more expert in this than me. But I'll come back to my slides here. And so part of this is coming out of my work as a manager and a supervisor, where for communicating for annual reviews, practicing connecting the impact that you're having to how you're spending your time, or what you're doing, how does that connect to impact? And just practicing telling that story, making that thread, and connecting it to the sort of visible things. I think that's a very important practice. So what are your activities? How did they lead to something visible? And how is it impacting the people you want to work with? Can you show how their behavior is changing? Can you have some indication of the positive change that you're making? And just practicing that is so important. And another outcome, I think, for me of engaging in this planning process is figuring out who I need to understand better. So who do I need to do a value proposition canvas for? Who do I need to really get how they're thinking about their work and what matters to them? And for you all, if this does resonate for you, I'd put it in your calendar to set aside some time to think about what's the work and how am I making it visible. And for me, it's very impactful for how I plan my whole year. But with that, we've got just a few minutes for questions or comments. I really appreciate those of you who wrestled with the process a little bit now. And thanks for your attention.
Great. So if anybody has any further questions, whether they'd like to enter them into the chat or raise their hand and ask Terence directly, that'd be fantastic. I have a question. We're in this age of tiny habits, atomic habits. And when you mentioned that book, Finding Patterns, I haven't had the chance to look at it, but finding patterns and anchoring, finding patterns in your own behaviors, and then anchoring new habits, new improvements is a big part of those books. So I was curious how much of a micro intervention, or did you think about, an activity? So many people were entering sort of group activities or organizational change activities. Did you think about how, micro habits might, if you said, we want to improve the quality of our reference interviews here. So what are the kind of micro interventions we could do so that our script or our way of approaching people so they feel, heard and included? How could we do something like that?
Sure. So if I were to approach that, like a team wants to improve the reference interviews, you might think about, well, one thing from this is, how would you know that? How would you assess whether or not that's going well or not? Right. So that's just one question. How would you assess that? But then you might say, well, we know, so if that's the impact, you might unpack that a little bit at the outcomes level and say, okay, we think it means that the people are, feel like it's well organized. They feel like it's more actionable. They feel like it's driven by expertise, and maybe like, oh, everybody feels that way. So you might say like, okay, unpacking that at the outputs level, you might just say, okay, that's where our assessment's happening. That's where we're making this improvement visible. And at your activity level, you might say, okay, we're going to explicitly practice in these structured ways, because that's what the research tells us. We're going to do research on how this can be more effective. And we're going to distribute our model for how we're going to carry out our reference in these channels, right? And then for your resources, you want to make sure, do we have the staff time to do this? When are we going to do this? What resources do we have to carry this out? So that's how I'd kind of like break that all down.
Thank you.
Well, that takes us right up to 1:45. If you all have any questions for me, you want to chat logic models, but you also, you're interested in talking entrepreneurship librarianship, please reach out. And thanks again to our organizers and to the string quartets for making all of this great music.
Yeah, thank you so much, Terence, for spending your time with us this afternoon and for your valuable insights. I went back and forth from being a librarian to a non-librarian, so it's very interesting to think about professional development and the opportunities in the domain of reflection. So thanks to everyone for participating as well through the Jamboards and your questions. Teresa will play music for the next 15 minutes or so, and we